If you didn't know this already, Sony is one of the biggest companies in the world when it comes to entertainment. They make some of the best TVs out there, they've got a massive library of movies and shows through their streaming service, and they also make some of the best gaming consoles ever. But despite all that success, the company has had its fair share of failures, and not the kind that you would expect. Welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be taking a look at some of the most embarrassing failures from Sony. Let's get into it. Founded in 1946, Sony has been around for over 75 years, and throughout that time, they have made some big mistakes. Before we get started with the list, though, I want to ask you guys for a favor. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos. With that said, let's begin with number 10 on this list, which is the Betamax. If you weren't around during the 80s, you may not remember the battle of the formats between Betamax and VHS. In the beginning, Betamax was actually winning because Sony was first to market and they had better picture quality. But as the years went on, VHS came out on top. Why? Well, the reason is pretty simple. VHS tapes were cheaper than Betamax tapes by about 20, so consumers decided to go with the more affordable option. On top of that, VHS also allowed for longer recording times, so it just made sense for people to buy VHS over Beta. In the end, this wasn't really a failure on Sony's part though, they simply just lost to a competitor. Sometimes that happens. It wasn't until later on that Sony realized that the real problem here was the fact that they were charging way too much for their tapes. They ended up losing out on millions of dollars in revenue because they thought that their customers were willing to pay more for better quality. But as soon as they lowered the prices, things turned around and Sony sold millions of Betamax players. Coming in at number 9 on this list, we have the Sony Walkman. The Sony Walkman is probably one of the most iconic pieces of tech ever. And although it failed to live up to its early success, that doesn't change the fact that it's one of the most important pieces of tech ever created. Next up on this list, we have the Sony A95K QD OLED TV. There's no denying that Sony makes some of the best TVs out there. They've won multiple awards for their Bravia lineup, and they're consistently at the top when it comes to picture quality. However, the Sony A95K QD OLED TV was not one of their better products. Now, you might be thinking, how can you call something a failure when it's just one TV model? Well, that's a great question, but there's more to it than just that. You see, before the release of the A95K, there were rumors that Sony was gonna be releasing a new OLED TV that would have micro-LED technology built in. Micro-LED is basically like OLED but on steroids. It's brighter, it's more efficient, and it can get up to 272 inches in size. Now, obviously, a 272-inch TV isn't practical for most people, but that's not the point. The point is that it shows how bright and efficient this tech is. Unfortunately, when the A95K came out, none of these features were present. To make things worse, the TV also had a ton of bugs that Sony couldn't fix. They even had to recall it in some countries, so needless to say, the Sony A95K was definitely a major disappointment. At number 7 on this list, we have the PlayStation 3. The PlayStation 3 was one of Sony's most ambitious consoles ever. It had a custom cell processor that was supposed to be way ahead of its time. It also had a new type of disk drive that was supposed to make game downloads faster. And finally, it had a brand new controller that was supposed to make games more immersive. Unfortunately, all 3 of these innovations turned out to be major flops. The custom cell processor ended up costing too much money and it wasn't powerful enough. The new disk drive ended up being slower than the PS2's disk drive, and the controller never got updated, meaning that it didn't support any new features. Because of all this, the PS3 ended up being one of Sony's least profitable consoles ever. Moving on, we have the Sony Xperia Z1. The Sony Xperia Z1 was supposed to be Sony's flagship phone for 2013. It had a massive 5-inch display, a 20-megapixel camera, and it was fully water-resistant. Unfortunately, it ended up being a huge flop. Sales of the Z series had been declining for a while now, and Sony needed a hit. They thought that the Z1 was going to be that hit, but it ended up being even worse than the previous model. The Z1's main selling point was supposed to be its camera, but it ended up being plagued with software issues that made pictures look washed out. To make things worse, the phone was also very expensive. It cost $650 when it came out, which was way more than the iPhone 5S or Samsung's Galaxy S4. At the end of the day, the Z1 was just another nail in the coffin for Sony's mobile business. Next up on this list, we have the Sony Reader. The Sony Reader was one of the first ebook readers on the market. It was released in 2006, and it was one of the most expensive ebook readers ever. It cost $500 when it came out, and it didn't even have a backlit display. Despite all this, Sony thought that the Reader would be a hit. They released 2 models of it, the Reader Pocket Edition and the Reader Daily Edition. Unfortunately, neither of them sold well. People were just starting to use their smartphones and tablets more and more, and they didn't see the need to buy an ebook reader. Plus, ebook readers were also very expensive back then, and that didn't help either. At the end of the day, the Sony Reader was just ahead of its time. Moving on, we have the Sony Mavica. The Sony Mavica was one of the first digital cameras on the market. It was released in 1981, and it cost $600 in today's money. The camera could only take 350,000 pictures, and it took forever to transfer them to a computer. Despite all this, Sony thought that the Mavica would be a hit. The D-Handy could play DVDs, CDs, and audio cassettes, and it had a 5-inch color display. Despite all this, the D-Handy was a huge flop. People were just starting to use their Game Boys and PlayStations more and more, and they didn't see the need to buy a portable DVD player. Plus, portable DVD players were also very expensive back then, and that didn't help either. In the end, the D-Handy only sold a few 100,000 units. Finally, at number 2 on this list, we have the Sony PSP. The Sony PSP was one of the most innovative gaming consoles ever. It had a touchscreen, Wi-Fi connectivity, and it could play movies and music in addition to games. Despite all this, the PSP was a huge flop. Sony thought that the PSP would be a hit with gamers, but they were wrong. The PSP was just too expensive, and it didn't have enough games to keep people interested. In the end, Sony sold just under 80 million PSPs, which was far less than they had hoped for. And finally, we have reached the last entry on this list, which is going to be the Sony Vision S. The Sony Vision S was one of the most ambitious projects that Sony had ever undertaken. It was a car that was supposed to be powered by artificial intelligence, and it was supposed to be released in 2020. Unfortunately, the project was canceled in 2019 because Sony didn't think that they could make the car affordable. The Vision S was supposed to be a game changer in the automotive industry. It would have changed the way that we drive forever. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed learning more about some of the most embarrassing failures from Sony. Which one do you think was the worst? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos.